Clancy's Tavern buzzed with its usual evening crowd. Laughter and the clinking of mugs filled the air, a welcome reprieve from the hardships of adventuring life. At a table near the hearth, Tritan, Ven, Grodd, and Lana were already seated, each engaged in their typical habits. Tritan nursed an ale, eyes scanning the room out of habit for any signs of trouble. Ven absent-mindedly plucking the strings of his lute, humming a soft tune while listening to snippets of conversation. Grodd leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face after finishing off a hearty meal. Lana, meanwhile, was eyeing a wealthy merchant at the bar, calculating whether his coin purse was worth the effort.
"Where's Mezra?"
Tritan muttered. Before anything else can be said, the tavern door swung open with a loud creak. Mezra strode in, her long elven robes swirling around her ankles. Her usually composed expression was frazzled, her eyes darting around until they locked onto Tritan and the others.
"Sorry I'm late."
Mezra began, her voice hurried. She paused mid-step as she accidentally bumped into a hooded figure who had just risen from a nearby table. The woman turned to face Mezra, her red hair shimmering like ruby threads in the tavern's dim light. Mezra froze, recognition dawning on her face.
"Oh, it's you. You're Relina."
She blurted out, her voice a mix of surprise and awe. The rest of the group exchanged curious glances. Relina, the famous dungeon raider and wizard, arched a brow, but said nothing. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she regarded Mezra.
I'm so sorry."
Mezra stammered, stepping back and bowing slightly.
"I didn't see you there. It's just, I've read stories of your exploits as a dungeon raider."
Mezra tries to recall the names of her former companions.
It was Mordius and Grex, wasn't it?"
Relina's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile before she straightened.
"Your apology is accepted. Be more mindful next time."
She turned to leave, but Mezra stepped forward again, her words rushing out.
"Wait, is something wrong?"
Relina stopped and turned her head slightly, her gaze sharp. For a moment, it seemed like she was going to respond, but instead, she turned on her heel and walked out of the tavern. Mezra watched her go, her shoulders slumping in disappointment. She turned back to the group, shaking her head.
"I can't believe I just bumped into Relina, one of the legendary wizards of Rel Kelthun."
Didn't seem too friendly.
Lana quipped, leaning back in her chair.
She looked ready to hex you for that little stumble.
"I will have you know that she is famous for her work, not her charm."
Mezra shot back, brushing past Lana's teasing. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and her eyes widened.
"Wait, what's this?"
Mezra bent down and picked up a small scroll, its edges embossed with intricate gold detailing. She turned it over in her hands and gasped.
"She must have dropped this. I'll be right back. I need to return it to her."
"Or we could open it and see if it's a treasure map,"
Ven suggested, his tone dripping with mischief.
"Don't even think about it."
Mezra snapped, already heading for the door. The cobblestone street outside Clancy's Tavern was quiet, bathed in the cool glow of a half-moon overhead. The faint scent of rain lingered in the air, the ground still damp from the afternoon's drizzle. Mezra's boots echoed as she hurried across the street, clutching the ornate scroll she had found on the tavern floor. Ahead, Relina moved with the grace of one accustomed to solitude, her red hair catching the moonlight like strands of woven ruby.
"Relina!"
Mezra called, her voice carrying through the still night. The high elf stopped in her tracks and turned slightly, her sharp green eyes locking onto Mezra. She waited in silence as Mezra approached, her expression a blend of curiosity and wariness.
"You dropped this,"
Mezra said breathlessly, holding out the scroll. Relina's gaze flickered to the scroll, and she reached out to take it.
"Thank you,"
she said softly, tucking it into a hidden pocket inside her robe. Her voice was measured and calm, but Mezra could sense a hint of unease beneath the surface. Mezra hesitated, uncertain whether to press further. Relina turned to leave, but Mezra spoke again, the words tumbling out before she could stop herself.
Wait, are you all right? You seemed distracted back there. My name is Mezra, by the way. I don't think we were properly introduced.
Relina turned back, her emerald eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment she said nothing, studying Mezra with an intensity that made the sorceress shift uncomfortably.
I am fine, Mezra.
Relina finally said, though her tone lacked conviction.
You don't look fine. I'm sorry if I'm overstepping, but something seems to be troubling you. Maybe I can help.
Relina's lips pressed into a thin line, and she sighed quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper.
You are persistent, aren't you? Very well. I do need assistance, though I am reluctant to involve anyone else in my business.
Mezra's brows furrowed in curiosity.
What kind of assistance?
Relina folded her arms, her gaze distant as though debating whether to continue. At last she spoke, her voice tinged with both resolve and reluctance.
I am searching for an artifact, a relic known as the portal key. It is said to have the power to open gateways to other planes of existence. Its origins are shrouded in mystery, but its value and significance cannot be overstated.
Mezra's eyes widened.
A portal key? That sounds extraordinary. Where is it?
Relina motioned toward the horizon, her tone grim.
The ruins of Culptis, an ancient city buried beneath centuries of rock and decay. It lies several days' travel from here, hidden in the heart of the Chasm of Echoes, a treacherous gorge known for its deadly beasts and unstable terrain.
Mezra exhaled sharply, her mind racing with both intrigue and apprehension.
That's not exactly a walk in the park.
No, it is not. I would retrieve the artifact myself, but circumstances prevent me from doing so. My time here is limited. I have pressing matters to attend to elsewhere.
Mezra tilted her head, concern flickering in her eyes.
If it's so important, why not delay your other business and go yourself? Surely someone of your skill could manage it.
Relina's gaze hardened, though not unkindly.
My reasons are my own, Mezra. Suffice it to say, I do not have the luxury of choice in this matter. That is why I must entrust this task to you only if you are interested and willing.
To me?
To you and your companions.
Relina clarified.
I have been hearing of your exploits recently during my brief stay here. You and your companions seem capable enough to handle this task. If not, there are other dungeon raiders I can try to find elsewhere.
Mezra blinked, momentarily taken aback. Praise from someone as renowned as Relina was unexpected and not unwelcome. She squared her shoulders, determination replacing her initial hesitation.
It would be an honor, Relina. What details can you give us to successfully retrieve this key?
Relina reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded map. The parchment was old, its edges frayed, but the intricate markings were still legible. She handed it to Mezra.
This map will guide you to the Chasm of Echoes and, eventually, to the ruins of Culptis. The portal key is said to be hidden deep within the city's central chamber, guarded by traps and other dangers. So be vigilant.
Mezra took the map, her fingers brushing against the delicate parchment.
After we retrieve the key, where shall we find you?
Here, in Solister. You can find me at the Tavern. I will compensate you handsomely for your efforts. But let me be clear. This artifact is not a trinket to be trifled with. Its power is not fully understood, and its misuse could have catastrophic consequences.
Mezra nodded solemnly.
Understood. We will take great care retrieving it and getting it back to you safely.
Relina studied her for a moment, as if weighing her sincerity. Finally, She gave a small nod.
Good. I leave this task in your hands, Mezra. Do not fail.
With that, Relina turned and disappeared into the streets, her robe trailing behind her like a shadow. Mezra stood in the street, clutching the map tightly, the weight of the task settling heavily on her shoulders. The warmth of Clancy's Tavern welcomed Mezra as she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a gust of cool night air following her inside. The lively hum of patrons enjoying their drinks and meals filled the space, but her focus immediately fell on her companions, seated at their usual corner table. Tritan sat with his arms crossed, his face reflective as he absently stared at the table. Lana leaned against her chair, idly spinning a dagger between her fingers, while Grodd nursed his ale, muttering under his breath about something unrelated to the mission. Ven, seated slightly apart, strummed soft, almost melancholic notes on his lute, the sound barely rising above the chatter. Mezra approached swiftly, her robes swaying with her stride. The parchment Relina had entrusted her with were clutched tightly in her hands. Tritan looked up as she arrived, his sharp gaze immediately catching her urgency.
Everything okay with your friend?
Indeed. Something important has come up.
Mezra said, setting the parchment on the table, which caught everyone's attention. Lana's dagger stopped spinning, Grodd set his mug down with a thud, and even Ven's fingers stilled on his lute strings.
What kind of important?
Tritan asked. Leaning forward slightly, Mezra hesitated, her eyes flicking over her companions. The weight of the task Relina had laid upon her pressed heavily on her shoulders. She took a deep breath and began.
As I mentioned earlier, her name is Relina, the wizard from Rel Kelthoon. Don't you all remember her?
Grodd's brow furrowed.
Wasn't she one of the senior dungeon raiders from back in the day?
The same.
Mezra confirmed.
And?
She's here in Solister just passing through, or so she claims. But there's something off about her. She seemed distracted, almost troubled. Long story short, she asked me a favor to find a mystical artifact.
Mezra spreads the parchment on the table, revealing a crude drawing of a map. The others leaned in as she spread the parchment out, revealing faded markings and intricate notations.
It leads to the Chasm of Echoes, and beyond that, to the ruins of Cultus.
Cultus, I've heard the name before. Ancient city, long abandoned, supposedly cursed.
Cursed or not, Relina believes an artifact called the Portal Key exists there. She wants us to retrieve it for her.
Silence settled over the group as they processed this. Lana's sharp eyes studied the map, her fingers tracing one of the markings.
The Chasm of Echoes isn't exactly a stroll through the countryside. Even getting there will be a challenge.
Triton's brow furrowed with unease. His voice was low.
More importantly, why would Relina want this key? Is it just to keep as some rare artifact? Or is it something more, like she plans to use it for what it was actually meant to do?
Mezra shifted, her arms still crossed, but her gaze softening.
I don't know. She didn't tell me that part. But I know Relina. She wouldn't go through all this trouble unless it was for something that mattered. Something bigger than just herself.
She met Triton's eyes, her voice steady despite the uncertainty.
Whatever her reasons, I believe it's for the greater good.
Triton nodded slowly, but the unease didn't leave his face.
What exactly is she paying us to see this quest through and get the key for her?
She didn't specify.
Grodd lets out a low growl, shaking his head.
Figures. Wizards always expect you to risk your neck for nothing.
She did say she'd compensate us handsomely for our efforts once we returned. I believe her. She doesn't seem like someone who would lie about something like this.
Triton leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms.
What's the risk?
Mezra's gaze darkened slightly.
High. The ruins are said to be filled with traps, ancient wards, and other dangers. And the Chasm of Echoes is notorious for its predators.
Lovely.
Lana said dryly.
It sounds perilous.
And Triton admitted.
but we've faced peril before.
Ven finally spoke, his voice softer than usual, though tinged with his usual wry humor.
This isn't just peril, it's a leap into the unknown. If the stories are true, the portal key is a relic unlike any we've encountered. It could be worth it, or it could be the death of us. Either way, I could use the fresh air.
Tritan agreed, tapping the table lightly.
Preparedness is key. If we do this, we do it right. No rushing in blind.
The group fell into a brief silence, each member mentally preparing for the journey ahead. Mezra glanced at the map again, her thoughts swirling with equal parts excitement and trepidation. The ruins of Culptus held promise, but also danger.
Let's get some rest tonight. We leave at first light.
Tritan finally said, rising from his seat. The others nodded, pushing back their chairs and preparing to retire for the night. The air in the ancient city of Cultus was stifling, filled with the dry scent of dust and decay. The faint light filtering through cracks in the cavern ceiling above did little to illuminate the ruins, casting long shadows over the crumbling stone buildings and broken statues. The city had once been magnificent. Its towering spires and intricate carvings still hinted at its former glory. Now, however, it was a graveyard of the past, its secrets buried beneath layers of time and darkness. Tritan led the group cautiously down a cracked cobblestone path that wound through the heart of the ruins. His sword was drawn, the blade glinting faintly in the dim light. Behind him, Mezra clutched her staff tightly, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Grodd followed behind, his gruff demeanor tempered by a rare silence. Lana moved with her usual grace, her keen eyes darting between the shadows. At the rear, Ven held his lute slung across his back, his whip coiled at his side. His usual humor had been replaced with a tense wariness.
This place feels wrong.
Mezra murmured, her voice barely above a whisper.
Wrong doesn't even begin to cover it. It's like the walls are watching us.
Tritan raised a hand, signaling for silence. The group froze, their ears straining for any sound beyond their own breathing and the faint echo of their footsteps. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a low, guttural growl reverberated through the air, sending a chill down their spines.
Did anyone else hear that?
Lana asked, slowly drawing out her daggers.
Shadow hounds.
Mezra whispered, her voice tense. The creatures emerged from the darkness, their sleek black forms blending almost seamlessly with the shadows around them. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their teeth glinted like shards of broken glass. There were 5 of them, their movements fluid and predatory as they circled the group.
They don't look like the negotiating type.
Ven said, uncoiling his whip. Tritan didn't waste any time.
Form up, keep your backs to each other, and don't let them separate us.
The group moved instinctively, forming a tight circle with Tritan at the forefront. The hounds lunged almost simultaneously, their movements impossibly fast. Tritan met the first hound with a powerful swing of his sword, the blade slicing through the creature's shadowy form. It let out a piercing howl before dissolving into smoke. Mezra raised her staff, her voice ringing out as she cast a spell. A burst of radiant light erupted from the tip of her staff, striking one of the hounds and sending it scrambling back, its form flickering like a dying flame. Grodd let out a battle cry as he swung his great axe with all his might, cleaving a hound in 2. While Lana moved with her usual agility, darting in and out of the fray. Her daggers found their mark again and again, each strike accompanied by a faint hiss as the shadowy creatures recoiled. Ven's whip cracked through the air, its tip wrapping around the leg of one hound and yanking it off balance. The battle was fierce and unrelenting, the hounds attacking with a ferocity that seemed almost otherworldly. Despite their teamwork, the group found themselves pushed to their limits. Tritan's armor bore fresh scratches. Mezra's spells began to falter as her energy waned. and even Grodd, with his immense strength, showed signs of fatigue. Finally, with a final burst of radiant energy from Mezra and a coordinated effort from the rest of the group, the last hound dissolved into smoke. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of the group's labored breathing. The group pressed on, their pace slower now as they navigated the ruins with even greater caution. The battle had taken its toll, but they knew they couldn't afford to stop, not when the portal key was so close. As they approached what appeared to be the central plaza of the city, Mezra's eyes widened.
There,
She said, pointing to a pedestal at the center of the plaza.
the portal key.
The artifact was small but unmistakable, a crystalline structure that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. It rested on the pedestal, as though waiting for them, but the group knew better than to let their guard down.
All right, Lana, check for traps. Mezra, keep an eye out for magical wards. The rest of us will stand guard.
Tritan said, his voice firm. Lana moved forward cautiously, her daggers drawn. She scanned the area meticulously, her trained eyes searching for anything out of place.
Traps. 2 pressure plates, 1 tripwire. Nothing I can't handle.
As Lana worked, Mezra circled the pedestal, her staff glowing faintly as she chanted an incantation. After a moment, she nodded.
There's a ward, but it's weak. I can dispel it.
Mezra raised her staff, her voice steady as she cast the spell. The ward shimmered briefly before dissolving, and Lana stepped back, her task complete.
It's clear.
Tritan approached the pedestal cautiously, his hand reaching out to grasp the portal key. As his fingers closed around the artifact, the faint light pulsing within it seemed to intensify for a moment before settling.
Got it. Let's move. The sooner we're out of this place, the better.
The group nodded, their determination renewed, as they began the journey back through the ruins, the portal key now safely in their possession. The journey back to Solister was long and arduous. Tritan and his companions moved cautiously, their senses heightened after the trials they had faced in the ruins of Culptus. Though the worst seemed behind them, the dangers of the wilderness were ever present. Each night, they took turns, keeping watch, the eerie cries of nocturnal creatures serving as a constant reminder of the peril that lurked in the shadows. On the second night, as the group set up camp beside a shallow creek, Mezra sat by the fire, turning the portal key over in her hands. The artifact shimmered faintly in the firelight, its crystalline form catching the eye of her companions.
Careful with that thing. You might accidentally send us to the 9 hells or something.
Ven said, strumming his lute softly to ease the tension in the camp. Mezra shot him a glare but couldn't suppress a small smirk.
You're welcome to hold it if you'd like to test your luck, my dear bard.
I think I'll pass. I'm content to stay on this plane of existence, thank you very much.
Ven said, his tone light but his eyes lingering on the artifact with curiosity. Tritan leaned heavily against a weathered tree, the flickering firelight casting shadows across his thoughtful face. His sharp gaze lingered on the darkness beyond the campfire, ever watchful as he slipped a hand into his pouch and drew out the amulet. The intricate piece glinted faintly in the glow, its mysteries as impenetrable as the man who had hired him and his companions to retrieve it. Tritan's brow furrowed as he turned it over in his hand, weighing not only its significance, but the choice before him, whether to return it to its owner or seek the deeper truths it concealed. The quiet crunch of boots on the forest floor broke his thoughts. Ven emerged from the shadows, a small bottle of rum in hand. With a mischievous smile, he held it out to Tritan.
A copper piece for your thoughts, my good man.
Tritan stiffened, slipping the amulet back into his pouch with a deft motion before taking the bottle. He nodded his thanks to Ven and raised the rum to his lips, the warmth of the drink doing little to thaw the chill of his thoughts. Before he could find the words to deflect the question, Ven tilted his head knowingly.
Listen, Tritan. You don't have to say it. But it's about your mother, isn't it?
Ven began gently, his voice tinged with concern. The words struck like a chord in Triton's chest. His hand tightened around the bottle, his eyes shimmering briefly before he looked away. He forced a weak smile and changed the subject.
Hey, that's some damn fine rum. Where'd you snaggle it from, Ven? A pirate?
Ven caught the shift and let it happen, his smile softening as he stepped into the game.
But of course, only the finest from Captain Barnacle Bill Bimbleboots himself, scourge of the Azure Sea.
Triton chuckled quietly, the weight on his chest easing just slightly as Ven's antics filled the night with a fleeting sense of normalcy. For now, the questions could wait. The gates of Solister came into view as the sun dipped below the horizon on the third day. The sight of the city's familiar walls and bustling streets brought a wave of relief over the group. Exhausted but triumphant, they made their way to Clancy's Tavern, their unofficial headquarters and sanctuary after every job. The tavern was alive with activity. The sound of clinking mugs, lively chatter, and the occasional burst of laughter filling the air. As Triton pushed open the door, the familiar scent of roasted meats and fresh ale welcomed them like an old friend.
There's my favorite band of troublemakers. Back in one piece, I see.
Clancy called from behind the bar, his ruddy face breaking into a grin.
Barely.
Grodd muttered, but even he couldn't hide a faint smile as he beelined for his favorite seat. As they settled into their usual table near the hearth, Mezra's eyes immediately landed on Relina. The High Elf wizard sat at a corner table surrounded by her aides, who were deeply engrossed in the scrolls and tomes spread out before them. Relina's red hair was tied back, her emerald eyes scanning a large, weathered map. She exuded an air of quiet authority, even in the chaotic atmosphere of the tavern. Mezra stood, the portal key clutched tightly in her hand. Relina looked up at Mezra as she stood, then approached the table where Mezra's companions sat. Her expression softened at the sight of the artifact. Mezra handed her the portal key, and Relina examined it closely. For a moment, she was silent, her fingers gently tracing the crystalline edges of the key. Then, a rare, genuine smile spread across her face, a flicker of delight breaking through her usual composure.
You've done well. You've exceeded my expectations,
Relina said, her voice warm but measured. Mezra nodded, a faint flush of pride coloring her cheeks.
I hope it was worth it to you.
Relina gestured to one of her aides, who handed her a small satchel. She turned back to Mezra and her companions, now gathered near the table, and handed each of them a pouch filled with gold coins.
It is more than you will ever know. Here, for your efforts,
she said simply. Grodd's eyes lit up as he weighed the pouch in his hand.
Now this is the kind of reward I can appreciate.
Generous. You sure you don't want to hire us for your next venture, milady?
This task required skill and resilience, which you have in abundance. But where I'm headed next, it's a path I must walk alone.
She turned her attention back to Mezra, her expression turning serious.
Magic can be many things. Mystical, mysterious, fascinating, powerful, and dangerous. It's a tool, but it's also a responsibility. Don't let its allure blind you. Use it wisely and never abuse it.
Mezra nodded solemnly, her usual confidence tempered by the weight of Relina's words.
I'll remember that.
Relina studied her for a moment longer before turning to her aides.
Gather everything. We leave for the dead kingdom of Kalidor tonight.
The Dead Kingdom? You're not serious.
Lana said, her tone tinged with disbelief.
I am. There's unfinished business there that I can no longer delay.
The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Relina offered no further explanation. She stood, her aides following her lead, as they began packing up their scrolls and tomes. Before she left, Relina placed a hand on Mezra's shoulder.
You have great potential. Don't waste it.
With that, she swept out of the tavern, her red hair catching the light of the hearth as she disappeared into the night. Mezra returned to the table, her thoughts clearly preoccupied. Tritan watched her for a moment before speaking.
She was right, you know. You've got something special. Don't let anyone take that from you.
Thanks, Tritan.
Now, who's up for a proper meal? I'm thinking steak, ale, and maybe a roast or two.
Grodd said, then chuckled.
I'll join you, Grodd, though I'll pass on the roast. I've got songs to play and stories to weave tonight.
And I've got a few patrons to charm out of their coin purses.
Lana smirked. Tritan leaned back in his chair, his usual stern expression softening.
Let's enjoy the evening and the next few days. We've earned it.
The road ahead was uncertain, but Clancy's Tavern was the only place they could truly call home.